Hi, my name is Gabe Ignetti, and I'm here to talk to you about a subject that is quite controversial: nuclear power. So you may ask, what motivated me to be here talking to you today about this? It's really very simple. Just like you, I'm concerned about our fossil fuel addiction, and I want to do my part to drive a stake right through the heart of the fossil fuel industry. And nuclear is simply the best way to do it. Now, nuclear power has had a problem. Since the day of its inception, it looked like this. And ever since, people have confused it with that. And it often seems that any time I speak about this subject, the reaction is this. But on a serious note, in a way, we are all like the kids in this picture. There's a name for it: confirmation bias. We're all wrong at times, and nobody likes to admit it. Even the best and the brightest among us have their biases. There's no saying that science advances one funeral at a time. So I'm challenging you all to have the courage to re-examine your conclusions based on new evidence, and feel free to challenge me as well. What I'm about to present to you will be nothing less than a shocking redefinition of what is commonly perceived of as reality, but it is backed by facts, hard data, and science. So let me start to unpack some urban myths. First, nuclear reactors cannot do this. It is physically impossible. And living next to a nuclear power plant for 1 year will give you less radiation exposure than eating a banana. Okay, but what if there was a nuclear meltdown? Isn't that dangerous? Well, accidents happen in all major industries, but studies indicate that even the worst possible accident at a nuclear plant is less destructive than any other major industrial accident, or even living near a fossil fuel plant in normal operation. So let's put this into perspective. Everything we do is dangerous. Even climbing the stairs or walking down the street could be considered to be dangerous. It's twice as dangerous if you're doing this. Well, climbing stairs has actually caused 12,000 deaths per year. And between ground level slips and falls and pedestrian fatalities, roughly 6,700 fatalities occur each year in the US just by walking. Now, how does that compare to deaths in the United States from severe nuclear power? Well, actually, there were 0 fatalities. No deaths ever. Out of all the energy sources, nuclear is the safest, according to all the accepted worldwide energy fatality data. And nuclear saves lives. 1.8 million lives have been saved from air pollution, and an additional 7 million lives could be saved in the next 4 decades by replacing fossil fuels with atomic energy. But there is one thing that nuclear power is not safe for, and that's the fossil fuel industry. So, when the old Sierra Club came out strongly for nuclear power, the executive officer of Atlantic Richfield Petroleum responded by facilitating the breakaway of the anti-nuclear Friends of the Earth with the help of a hefty $500,000 donation in today's dollars. So, the anti-nuclear agenda goes hand in hand with the fossil fuel industry's favorite pastime of promoting their bridge to nowhere. In 2007, the Sierra Club accepted $25 million in donations from the gas industry to promote natural gas as the bridge fuel to renewable energy. And they wouldn't be lying, because wind and solar farms work only about a third of the time, and the gap is usually filled most easily and nimbly by gas. The biggest blow to nuclear power came from the Shoreham protests, which were supported by a full-page ad by the Oil Heat Institute. These protests succeeded in closing down the newly completed nuclear power plant. LILCO took a $6 billion beating for that, which basically chased away most private investors for good. And they were right. Accidents happen in every large industry. But if an accident at 3 Mile Island, which caused 0 fatalities and only sent the equivalent of a fraction of a chest x-ray, could cause Shoreham to close, then, well, yes, nukes weren't safe. For investors, that is. What followed was the loss of supply chains and expertise that has ended up making nuclear power plant construction the equivalent of building a Lamborghini by hand in your backyard. In the meanwhile, Asia has been taking the lead, with construction times varying between 3 and 5.5 years. The closing of Shoreham marked the beginning of the end of the nuclear industry. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry has a long history of funding anti-nukers along with climate deniers to protect their bottom line, which is quite unfortunate because the news on climate seems to always be looking worse than expected. And that's not just my personal opinion. I hope we could agree that decarbonization is an imperative. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, nuclear power currently provides over half the clean electricity in the United States. And every time we hear of another nuclear plant shut down anywhere, if there's one thing that's undeniable, it is that we're moving backwards. When people argue that renewables will replace those plants, what they're really saying is that instead of moving forward, let's create a giant hole in our existing clean energy supply and play catch up. You would think that all the environmental organizations that have declared a climate emergency would at least say, wait, stop. This is not the time to be doing this. But it is the exact opposite. Most all of these big organizations actually support the shutting down of nuclear power. I have a big problem with that. It makes about as much sense to shut down nuclear power in the midst of a climate crisis as it does to close all the fire hydrants next to a 4-alarm fire. It's like we're deliberately entering the ring for the fight of our lives with one hand tied behind our backs. I might add that all this is based on an unsubstantiated assumption that we could replace the most energy-dense power source in existence with sources of power with the least energy density, and that ripping down perfectly good nuclear plants would be better economically and environmentally. That's a tall order. It makes no sense to accept the call of the IPCC for decarbonization within the next 12 years, and yet reject their conclusion that these goals are impossible without nuclear power. The IPCC, the National Academy of Sciences, MIT, and the Union of Concerned Scientists all have come out for nuclear in the mix as being necessary to achieve decarbonization. In fact, the IPCC's 2014 assessment clearly states that scenarios that are likely to maintain warming at below 2 degrees Celsius must include the tripling to nearly quadrupling of nuclear power. The IPCC team of 91 scientists came up with 90 different mixes of solutions that would keep warming limited to 1.5 degrees, but none of them work without atomic energy. The German experience proves it with 2 decades and over €500 billion lost in the pursuit of 100% renewables. The result was that the Germans ended up leading the EU in deaths from coal pollution and the cost of electricity as well. In the meanwhile, France decarbonized 75% of its grid in less time with nuclear power, and they also produce cheaper electricity than their neighboring countries. And Germany is not the only nation that has problems with 100% renewables. Texas power prices jumped from less than $15 to as much as $9,000 a megawatt hour as coal plant retirements and weak winds left the region on the brink of blackouts during a heat wave. In Australia, Regulators took 4 wind farm operators to court, alleging that their facilities contributed to a massive 2016 blackout. The incident has sparked a debate over whether Australia should even allow the grid to become so dependent on renewable energy. And solving this problem with a battery backup is simply a non-starter. The annual output of the world's largest backup battery factory would require 1,000 years of production to make enough batteries for 2 days' worth of U.S. electricity demand. And while hydro as a backup is more effective, it isn't that much better. Hydroelectric dams are not only damaging to the ecosystems, but they also produce nitrous oxide, along with 1 billion tons of methane a year. That's why the Sierra Club had once loudly and rightfully called for the shutting down of dams instead of nuclear. It's not for nothing that their motto was once atoms, not dams. And dams that are the backbone of renewable energy are also the most dangerous source of energy as well. Almost 1,700 dams across the United States are at risk. And that old Sierra Club slogan is no less true today. 8,785 new hydropower dams are planned in Europe alone. More than a quarter of these hydropower projects are situated in protected areas, mainly in national parks. The worst energy accident in history, worst two, that is the Baku Dam failure in China in 1975, which killed 171,000 people, and the Mechuchu Dam failure in India in 1979, which killed 5,000 to 10,000. In comparison, nuclear power's worst accident produced roughly 43 casualties so far. Now, comparing casualty statistics is never pretty, and every life is precious, but nonetheless, these numbers are telling. The Chernobyl event was a textbook picture of the sort of hubris that used to exist around nuclear energy in the bad old days. Chernobyl had no containment vessel. It had an inherently unstable design. Safety mechanisms were deliberately turned off for a test ordered by Moscow. Furthermore, evacuations and corrective actions were delayed for roughly 3 days because the closed society enabled the authorities to hide it. That delay ended up increasing sickness and death. Neither the Chernobyl nor Fukushima Daiichi plants would have been approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, nor would such a scenario ever be repeated. It makes about as much sense to shut down nuclear power plants because of Chernobyl as it does to close all airports because of the crash of the Hindenburg. What about the damage to the environment, you might ask? Well, the area around Chernobyl was predicted to be a nuclear desert, but instead it has become an enormous nature preserve. Interestingly, the inhabitants who remained outlived the evacuees. Now, I know at this point there are some of you who just want to scream out, "What about Fukushima?" The fact is that there was 0 recorded radiation casualties at Fukushima. So we need to ask ourselves, if Fukushima was such a massive, long-lasting health catastrophe, how is it that 4 years later, Japan broke its all-time record for longevity? In fact, Japan continues to remain a perennial world leader in longevity in spite of having experienced 2 atomic bombings and 3 nuclear meltdowns. The real culprit in the deaths of Fukushima was not nuclear power, but rather the hysteria around radiation, whose roots are in the radiophobia that has been spread by the anti-nuclear movement. So right now you might be thinking, well, how about the fish? Didn't Fukushima contaminate the entire Pacific and all those fish? The increase in ocean radiation from Fukushima is actually too tiny to be measured on a Geiger counter, so the fish off Japan are fine. The evidence all points to there simply being no radiation deaths from Fukushima on land or sea. It really boils down to the fact that the fear of low-level radiation has no bearing in science. In fact, recent studies on the biological effects of radiation demonstrate that the absence of radiation is not good for organisms. And many scientists have concluded that low-level radiation very much mimics how vaccines work in strengthening our immune systems. Amazingly, a study in the Journal of Genes and Environment has subsequently found that low-dose radiation from the atomic bombings in Japan actually elongated the lifespans and reduced cancer mortality relative to non-irradiated individuals. You heard it right. The atomic bomb survivors lived longer. Reportedly, the unhappiest man in the world, Mr. Tsutomu Nagamuchi, was a victim of 2 atomic bombings. More than 70 people were evacuated from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All except him were killed. More surprisingly is that the 2A bombs did not shorten his life. He died of stomach cancer at the ripe old age of 93. So the Japanese are quite healthy. But in the end, the critics may be proven right about increasing deaths. Halting the country's nuclear reactors has led Japan to fire up at least 8 new coal-powered plants in just the past 2 years. Japan has plans for an additional 36 more coal plants over the next decade. Ironically, coal production leaves behind 100 times the radiation of nuclear power. The fact of the matter is that radiation is ubiquitous. Natural radioactive elements, including uranium, plutonium, and potassium-40 that are constantly leaching to the Earth's surface, dwarf the radiation from all nuclear accidents combined. That is because the entire planet is a giant furnace in an ongoing state of radioactive decay. In fact, the Earth has actually been more radioactive during the time of our evolution than it is today. In fact, 2 billion years ago, 17 naturally occurring nuclear fission reactors operated in what today is known as Gabon in West Africa. So nuclear power is all natural? Well, I don't believe we've found any naturally formed 2 billion-year-old windmills or solar panels yet. So yes, in a sense, nuclear power is all natural. And uranium extraction from seawater is close to commercialization, which will make nuclear power renewable as well. That will mean no more uranium mining ever. So you might be asking, what about the nuclear waste? The radiation will last for 1 million years, and our only choice is to stop building nuclear power plants. But if that's true, you know what we really need to stop building first? Granite tables. Now you need to sit down for this. That granite table that these guys are sitting on has a radioactive half-life of over 4 billion years. Yikes. Actually, big numbers may sound scary, but without toxicity or fatality data, they're just big and scary and meaningless. Besides, all things being equal, the longer the half-life, the less radioactive an element is. It's the smaller numbers that are dangerous. But you haven't heard the kicker yet. You see that nuclear canister over there? That nuclear fuel canister, that is? What if I told you that it might not contain any waste at all? There's great potential for extraction of many valuable elements from spent fuel. And these numbers fluctuate. Platinum, $30,000 kilogram, palladium 56,000, rhodium 64,000, ruthenium $90,000 a kilogram, and many other valuable elements, which make these canisters a literal gold mine. Japan and India are already recovering rhodium and other precious metals from nuclear spent fuel. And the amount of radiation fatalities from handling these spent fuel canisters worldwide is, you guessed it, 0. What we need to keep in mind here is that the entire world's supply of high-level nuclear waste can fill a football field. And over 96% of that spent fuel is reusable to power advanced Gen 4 reactors for centuries. A Gen 4 molten salt waste-burning reactor that is walk-away safe is scheduled for completion in 2024. The radioactive byproducts will be reduced from several hundred thousands of years down to 20 or 30 years. The radioactive remains from spent nuclear fuel are used in nuclear medicine. They also power space probes as well as robots for NASA, and are even used for food irradiation. This process is 100% safe, and it protects us from foodborne illnesses. So, while we're on the topic of food, I guess you've noticed that we have a thing for bananas. But I would like to talk about the anti-nukers' favorite fruit, cherries. Or to be exact, cherry picking. Did anyone ever notice how environmental organizations' narratives on phony nuclear waste crisis says nothing about renewable waste? And it's a big problem. These waste gases from solar panel production are up to 23,000 times more potent than CO2 and can remain in the atmosphere for 10,000 years. And these are some of the more toxic chemicals from solar, which will never leave the environment. Silicon tetrachloride, gallium diselenide, cadmium telluride, and many other nasty toxic materials. 74% of global solar production comes from China, which has had riots over solar production. And there's lots of it. Solar panels produce 300 times more waste than nuclear due to their very low energy density. And its potential for reaching its physical limits of energy density is piddling compared to nuclear fission, which is nothing less than astronomical. That is why, if all the waste from the electricity you ever lose in a lifetime was exclusively from nuclear, it would be the size of a soda can. Or if it came from a Gen 4 reactor, it would be roughly the size of a pellet. And even the short-term density of renewables has already been grossly overstated. It's been estimated that a transition to wind and solar power in the United States would require 5 to 20 times more land than previously thought. The ecological footprint of solar power development could grow to more than 27,500 square miles, roughly the area of South Carolina, if the U.S. were to adapt more ambitious climate goals. Renewable failures are not for lack of government support. Renewable mandates, which were designed to incentivize clean energy expansion, have actually caused the opposite effect. These mandates, which exist in 29 states so far, require that utilities purchase a percentage of their electricity from qualifying renewable sources. These ill-conceived energy plans force electric grids to play a near impossible balancing act between accommodating demand and reacting to unpredictable weather, all at a reasonable price to consumers. What we might think of as benign solar or wind spells often lead to massive electric spikes and wild fluctuations that could cause electric prices to either go negative or shoot up astronomically. This has ended up driving nuclear power plants out of business simply because their profitability is dependent on them running full time and they're physically incapable of turning on and off quickly to accommodate the prioritization of renewables. In total, renewable energy has gotten 15 times the subsidies of nuclear power, thus making it even less competitive. Nuclear power deserves a level playing field based on their reliability alone. After all, keeping power running is crucial in sub-freezing weather and heat waves. When it comes to reliability, nuclear is number one, while the renewable comes in last. The reliability of nuclear power plants is largely based on their superior construction, which has enabled them to withstand the polar vortex, which has frozen coal supplies, gas lines, and wind power solid while burying solar panels under tons of snow. Nuclear power plants have withstood the worst natural disasters, including hurricanes, earthquakes, and even the Fukushima tsunami. Yes, surprisingly, there were nuclear power plants that survived the tsunami. The Onagawa plant, which is even closer to the epicenter of the 9.0 earthquake than the Fukushima Daiichi plant, along with the Fukushima Daini plants, both survived this tragic event and were operational. Luckily, they were not dangerously exposed as a result of TEPCO's cutting corners on safety. And renewables are fragile in comparison. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, the nation's second largest solar farm, responsible for 40% of the island's solar energy, lost the majority of its panels. So, my talk would be incomplete if I failed to address the issue of nuclear proliferation. Over the 70 years that encompass the atomic age, no nuclear reactor has ever produced an atomic bomb. It is far easier for a nation to build facilities explicitly for that purpose. In fact, nuclear power is actually used to disincentivize proliferation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty bars any nation that pursues an atomic weapon from receiving nuclear technology. No better illustration of this can be made than the two Koreas. India's civilian program is hampered in their pursuit of atomic energy by their weapons program as well. Not only that, but the megatons to megawatts program under the U.S. Nuclear Disarmament Treaty with Russia ended up turning 20,000 atomic bombs into peaceful nuclear energy. For the past 2 decades, 10% of all the electricity consumed in the United States has come from Russian nuclear warheads. Furthermore, advanced Gen 4 molten salt reactors will use up spent fuel so completely as to leave practically nothing fissionable behind, and they're capable of turning existing stockpiles of plutonium into fuel as well, thus making these materials unavailable for use in nuclear weapons. I might add that their inherent simplicity will make them mass producible and their energy extremely cheap. In the final analysis, the real risk from nuclear power is that we will not use it to the fullest and that gambling our future on failed alternatives will ultimately lead us into the chaos of a hothouse Earth that will lead to a nuclear apocalypse. There are 2 roads that the atom could take us on: to peace and prosperity, or oblivion and war. What path we choose, we have yet to see. But in the end, the most dangerous enemy that we face is our own fear. Marie Curie put it best: nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Thank you.